The morning I decided the fortress had to come down, I was standing on the observation deck watching my daughter teach a dead woman's son how to swim. The boy, Callum, was 7. My daughter, Norah, was 19. The water in the protected cove was 58 degrees, and Callum kept gasping and laughing, and Norah kept saying, "Kick, kick, kick," with a patience I'd never managed to teach her, and she'd apparently learned without me. Below them, under 12 feet of green Atlantic water, the barnacle-crusted pilings of my perimeter barrier ran in a semicircle from headland to headland, strung with netting and razor wire, and every piece of sharp salvage I'd welded into place over 9 weeks of increasingly obsessive construction. The fortress I'd built to keep everything out was now the thing preventing everything inside from surviving. But I'm telling this wrong. You need to understand what came before the swimming lesson, if you want to know why a man would tear down the fortress he built with his own hands. Subscribe now, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. My name is Connor Bryce. I'm 53. For 22 years, I was a marine welder. Underwater cutting and joining, hull repair, pier reconstruction. The kind of work that puts you in dark water with a torch and teaches you that the ocean is not your enemy, as long as you respect that it has no interest in your well-being. I was good at it. My hands are scarred in patterns that other welders can read like a resume. When my knees gave out and the dive work became untenable, I bought the decommissioned Coast Guard station on Cutter Point, 18 miles north of Rockport, Maine, with the intention of converting it into a marine welding school. Small scale, 6 students at a time, a place where I could teach what I knew without kneeling on steel plate 40 feet underwater. The station was built in 1941 on a granite promontory that juts into the Atlantic like a fist. 2 buildings. The main house, 2 stories, brick and timber, originally the crew quarters and operations center. And the boathouse, concrete and steel, built into the rocket waterline with a marine railway that could haul a 40-foot cutter. There was a diesel generator, a 10,000-gallon rainwater cistern, and a 100-yard gravel access road connecting to the coast highway. The property came with 4 acres of rocky shoreline, a deep-water cove protected by natural granite ledges on 3 sides, and a view of the open Atlantic that I loved with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who'd spent his life being paid to go into it. I closed on the property in April. The outbreak began in June. In between, I'd already started renovation, rewiring, replumbing, installing welding stations in the boathouse, reinforcing the marine railway. When the news started carrying reports from overseas that didn't make sense, I shifted my renovation in a direction that made less sense to my neighbor, Frank Pereira, who ran a lobster operation from the next cove south and watched me through binoculars with increasing concern. "Connor, why are you welding rebar cages to your pilings?" Frank asked one afternoon from his skiff, drifting 40 yards off my work zone while I stood waist-deep in the cove with a cutting torch. "Fish habitat," I said. "Fish habitat doesn't have razor wire. Aggressive fish." Frank was 67, Portuguese-American, built like a hydrant, and constitutionally incapable of minding his own business. He was also the first person I saw die, though not the first dead person I saw moving. And the distinction matters more than grammar suggests. The first moving dead person I saw was on June 14th, from the observation deck, through the 20-power spotting scope I'd mounted to watch the shipping channel. A figure on the public beach 3 miles south, walking into the surf repeatedly, being knocked down by waves, standing up, walking in again. Not swimming, not wading. Walking straight in as if the ocean were a hallway. Each time a wave tumbled it, it would reappear and resume. I watched for 40 minutes. The figure never changed its approach, never adjusted for the current. never showed any evidence of learning from the water's repeated rejection. That absence of adaptation was what convinced me. Not the news, not the emergency broadcasts. A human being who couldn't learn from a wave. I went inside and started welding the gate. The gate was the first piece of what I now recognize was a compulsion disguised as pragmatism. I welded it from steel plate and structural tube salvaged from the boathouse renovation, mounted it across the access road where the gravel met the coast highway, and backed it with a 12-foot wall of shipping containers I'd had delivered 2 weeks earlier under the fiction of needing storage for welding supplies. The containers formed a barricade that sealed the landward approach to the point. No vehicle was getting through. No group of people on foot was getting through without cutting tools and considerable time. Norah called me from Portland on June 15th. She was finishing her first year at the Maine College of Art, living in a shared apartment on Congress Street, and she was scared. Portland had confirmed cases. The university had suspended operations. Her roommates had left. "Come here," I said. "Dad, the highway is already backed up. Everyone's trying to go north. Then go south first. Take Route 1 to Bath, cross the Kennebec, come up the coast road. It'll be clear because everyone's on the interstate." She arrived at 2 a.m. on June 16th, driving the 12-year-old Subaru I'd bought her with the insurance money from the dive accident that ended my career. She looked like her mother. Dark hair, narrow face. The particular expression of someone who processes fear as irritation. Helen had died of pancreatic cancer when Norah was 14. And the last 5 years of our relationship had been a series of retreats disguised as conversations. Each of us pulling back from the thing we shared, grief, as if proximity to the other person's version of it would make our own worse. She walked through the gate, looked at the container wall, looked at me, and said, "This is insane. This is preparation." For what? A medieval siege? For whatever's coming. What's coming is a public health emergency, Dad, not a war. I didn't argue. I showed her to her room. The same one she'd slept in during her 2 previous visits to the station, still smelling of paint from the renovation, and went back to their boathouse to keep working. That was our pattern. I built. She watched me build. Neither of us addressed the real architecture of our problem, which was that I had not been a good father for 5 years, and converting a Coast Guard station into a fortress was easier than admitting it. The next week, I completed the perimeter. The landward side was the container wall with the gate. The seaward side was the water barrier. Rebar cages welded to the existing pilings of the old cutter mooring. Extended with additional pilings, I drove using a pneumatic hammer mounted on a barge I'd fabricated from oil drums and plywood. The barrier ran from the north headland to the south headland, fully enclosing the cove. The netting prevented anything from swimming through. The razor wire discouraged climbing. The whole structure was ugly, overbuilt, and exactly the kind of project a man undertakes when his hands need to stay busy so his mind doesn't catch up. Frank Pereira came through the gate on June 18th, not by invitation. He'd pulled his skiff onto the rocks south of my barrier, climbed the headland, and walked the shoreline to the station. He was carrying a 20-gauge shotgun and a paper grocery bag containing canned clam chowder, crackers, and a bottle of Jameson. "You built a wall across the cove," he said, setting the bag on the boathouse workbench. I did. That cove has been open water since before either of us was born. My grandfather pulled traps through there. You know that. I know that. So what gives you the right? That was the first time someone asked me the question I should have been asking myself. And I answered it the way I answered everything that year, with structural specifications. I told Frank about the current patterns, the tidal flow, The way the barrier was designed to allow water exchange while preventing passage of objects larger than 6 inches in diameter. I told him about the reinforcement schedule, the cathodic protection I'd applied to prevent corrosion, the breakaway panels I'd installed in case of extreme storm surge. I told him everything about the barrier except why I'd built it, which was that I was terrified, not of the dead, but of being the kind of man who couldn't protect his daughter again. Helen's cancer had been something I couldn't weld, couldn't cut, couldn't fabricate a solution to. It had taken her while I stood beside the bed with hands that were useless for the first time in my professional life. The barrier was the answer to the question Helen's death had asked me. What do you do when you can't do anything? You build. You build until the building is the doing, and the doing is enough. Frank drank the Jameson. Norah ate the chowder. Nobody asked any more questions about rights. Frank died on June 23rd. Not from the infection, from me. I need to tell this part without flinching, because flinching is how I've been handling it for 3 months, and it hasn't helped. Frank Pereira died because I had built a barrier that closed the only protected water in a 5-mile stretch of coast. And when his skiff engine failed during the first major surge of the dead along the shoreline road, he had nowhere to go except the open Atlantic or my wall. He radioed me on the Marine VHF channel we both monitored. I heard him clearly. "Connor, I'm coming in. Open the net gate." I could hear the outboard grinding, a fuel line problem. I diagnosed it by sound alone, the way you do when you've spent your life around marine engines. He was a 1/4 mile out, drifting south in the ebb current, and behind him on the shore road, I could see through the scope what he was running from. A mass of them, at least 30, that had walked north along Route 1 from Rockport and turned down the coast road, drawn by what I still believe was the sound of his engine. They were at the waterline. Some were walking into the surf the way that first figure had on day 1. The net gate was a section of barrier I'd designed to open for boat access. It operated on a winch system, manual, because I didn't trust electric motors in salt water, and took approximately 4 minutes to open and 4 minutes to close. 8 minutes of the cove being accessible to anything in the water. I started the winch. Frank was drifting closer, working the engine. Norah was beside me on the dock, watching the shore through binoculars. "There are people in the water," she said. "Not just on the road. In the water. 8, 10 of them. Swimming. Sort of." They didn't swim. They walked the bottom. I know this now because I've seen it from the observation deck dozens of times since. The dead entering the water and continuing their ambulatory pattern on the sea floor, moving in the direction they'd been heading when they encountered the waterline. Depth irrelevant, buoyancy irrelevant, air irrelevant. They walked until the bottom dropped below their ability to maintain contact, at which point they either stood in place or drifted with the current. But in shallow water, they advanced, and the approach to my cove was shallow for 200 yards before the ledges dropped off. The net gate was half open. Frank was 200 yards out, engine coughing. The first of the walking dead reached the barrier and hit the netting. It held. A second reached it, then a third. The net bowed inward with the current and their weight. "Close it," I said. "What?" Norah looked at me. "Frank's still outside. If that net fails, they're in the cove. Close the gate." "He's right there, Dad." Frank's voice on the VHF. "Connor, I'm almost in. 30 seconds. I was already at the winch. I reversed it. The gate began closing. Frank saw it. I know because his radio transmission changed from navigational to something I've never been able to listen to on replay. A sound that contained my name and a question, and the answer to the question all at once. The gate closed with Frank 40 yards outside. His engine caught momentarily, pushed him against the netting, and died. The dead reached his skiff 11 seconds later. I know the number because Norah counted. She counted because counting was the only thing she could do while watching a man she'd known her entire life disappear below the surface of water that I had fenced. Norah didn't speak to me for 3 days. When she did, the first thing she said was not an accusation. It was worse. You were right to close it. I know that. The math was right. And I will never forgive you for the math being right. This was the fracture. Not between me and the dead. Not between the station and the world, but between me and my daughter. I had done the correct thing for the wrong reason, or the wrong thing for the correct reason. I still can't determine which. And the result was that a man was dead, and my daughter understood me completely for the first time. And the understanding was a wall higher than anything I'd welded. I did what I always do. I went back to building. The building accelerated after Frank. I reinforced the net barrier with a secondary steel cable system that could withstand 3 times the load. I added an observation platform on the south headland, 20 feet above the waterline, with a clear sight line to the coast road in both directions. I mounted salvage floodlights on the boathouse roof, powered by the diesel generator, aimed outward at the water to give us night visibility. I welded shut the breakaway panels I'd originally installed for storm surge. Those panels had been the closest thing the barrier had to a concession, a built-in acknowledgement that the ocean should have final authority. And I removed them because I no longer wanted the ocean to have authority over anything inside my perimeter. Norah watched all of this from the observation deck. She drew. She'd brought her sketchbooks from Portland, the only possession she'd packed besides clothes and a photograph of Helen. And she filled pages with images of the station, the barrier, the water, and me. I found one of these drawings weeks later, left on the kitchen table like a letter she couldn't write. It showed me from behind, standing in the cove in my dry suit, welding torch in hand. And the sparks from the torch became the stars in the sky above. And the water around my legs was full of faces looking up. I don't know if the faces were the dead or the living. I don't think Norah did either. On June 29th, a boat appeared on the horizon, not a skiff. A 36-foot lobster boat, broad-beamed and heavy, riding low with weight. It came from the south, staying a mile offshore, and I tracked it through the spotting scope for 20 minutes before it turned toward the coast and I saw the people on deck. 8 of them. 2 adults, 6 children of various ages, huddled on the stern behind a barricade of coolers and fuel drums. The boat approached the barrier. The man at the helm, stocky, sunburned, wearing a Red Sox cap that seemed like a relic from a civilization that had worshipped different things, cut his engine and drifted to within shouting distance of the net gate. "We're out of fuel," he called. "I've got kids, please." I was on the dock. Norah was beside me. I could feel her looking at me in a way that was not looking at me, but looking at the decision I was about to make and measuring it against the last one. "How long have you been on the water?" I called back. 4 days. We left Gloucester. Everything south of Portland is gone. We've been running the coast looking for anywhere that's clear. Anyone bitten? Anyone sick? Nobody's bitten. 2 of the kids haven't eaten in 2 days. Norah said, "Open the gate, Dad." Not a request. A statement of what was going to happen, delivered in the voice of someone who had decided that if she couldn't forgive me for the math, she could at least overrule it. I opened the gate. The boat came through. I closed the gate behind it and watched the water for bottom walkers while the lobster boat tied up at the dock with the fumbling urgency of people who'd been terrified so long they'd forgotten how to perform simple tasks. The man's name was Gil Brennan. He was a charter boat captain from Gloucester. The woman was his sister, Patricia Brennan Ward, who taught 5th grade and was still 8 days into the apocalypse. carrying a canvas tote bag with a laminated hall pass clipped to the handle. The 6 children ranged from Callum, who was 7 and had not spoken since Gloucester, to a 15-year-old named Maya, who had Gil's jaw and Patricia's eyes, and an expression that suggested she had processed the end of the world faster than the adults and was waiting impatiently for them to catch up. The children's parents were dead. 4 were Patricia's students. 2, Callum and Maya, were Gil's. Their mother had been lost in Gloucester. Gil did not elaborate, and I did not ask, because I recognized in his silence the shape of a story that functioned only as long as it wasn't spoken. 8 people. My fortress had been built for 2. The math Norah would never forgive me for had just changed its terms. The math was simple and brutal. The station's resources: diesel fuel, stored food, rainwater capacity, physical space, could sustain 2 people for approximately 6 months. 10 people reduced that to 5 weeks. 5 weeks was not survival. 5 weeks was delayed failure with additional witnesses. I presented this to Gil and Patricia on the evening of their arrival, at the kitchen table in the main house, with the diesel generator humming outside and the floodlights casting white cones across the dark water. I laid out the numbers, because numbers were how I understood problems. And I expected them to understand the problem the same way. Gil listened. Patricia listened. Then Patricia said, "So what do you need us to do?" Not, "What are you going to do about it?" Not, "How will you fix this?" "What do you need us to do?" The question reframed the entire dynamic. I had been thinking of these people as a load on my structure. Patricia was thinking of them as labor in a system. "Fish," I said, because it was the only answer. The cove has a resident population of pollock and cunner. I've seen striped bass in the channel outside the barrier. If we can fish consistently, we extend the food supply indefinitely. But we need gear, and I spent the last month building walls instead of fishing rigs. "I know how to fish," Gil said. "I know how to build traps, set long lines, and jig for groundfish from a dock. What I need is material. The boathouse is a welding shop. I have steel stock, cable, hardware. Anything you can design, I can fabricate." That night, Gil drew trap designs on the back of a nautical chart while I calculated material requirements. It was the first conversation I'd had in 2 weeks that wasn't about defense, and the relief of it was physical. A loosening in my chest that I associated with welding mask removal. The moment you lift the dark glass and the world comes back in full color. Norah organized the children, not because anyone asked her to, but because she saw what needed doing and did it, which was Helen's trait, not mine. She set up sleeping quarters on the 2nd floor, rationed the existing food into a rotation that accounted for the children's smaller portions, and established a schedule for water collection, meal preparation, and what she diplomatically called quiet hours, which meant the period after dark when the floodlights went off to conserve fuel, and everyone stayed inside and tried not to listen to the sounds from the water. The sounds from the water were new. Since the barrier's completion, I'd been aware of occasional impacts. The dead hitting the netting, drifting, or walking into it. But with the floodlights off, I couldn't verify what I was hearing, and the sounds were increasing. Not dramatically, incrementally. A bump every few minutes became a bump every minute. The tidal pattern suggested accumulation. The dead were collecting against the barrier the way flotsam collects against a seawall, not by intent, but by current and gradient. Each tide brought more. I didn't tell anyone this. I told myself I was managing the information, waiting until I had enough data to present a clear picture. The truth was that I was afraid the clear picture would reveal that my barrier was doing exactly what I'd designed it to do, keeping things out while simultaneously doing something I hadn't designed it to do, becoming a dam behind which pressure built. Callum spoke for the first time on July 2nd. He said it to Norah, not to any of the adults, and what he said was, "Can we go in the water?" Norah looked at me. I said no. The cove water was inside the barrier, but the bottom walkers could breach under the net in places where the seabed was uneven and the netting didn't seal against the rock. I hadn't confirmed this. I suspected it. And suspicion was enough to justify prohibition, which was the same logic I'd used to close the gate on Frank. Maya, the 15-year-old, was standing in the boathouse doorway when I said no. She said nothing. But the way she looked at the water, and then at the barrier, and then at me, communicated a sequence of understanding that I found disquieting. She was measuring the distance between safety and imprisonment, and finding it negligible. July brought fog. Not the occasional morning haze of normal Maine summer, but a persistent marine layer that settled on the point like a second barrier, reducing visibility to 30 yards and transforming the station from a promontory with commanding views into a gray island in a gray void. The fog changed everything, because the fog took away the one advantage the fortress provided that wasn't physical: the ability to see what was coming. I couldn't watch the shoreline. I couldn't monitor the barrier. I couldn't track movement on the coast road. The spotting scope was useless. The floodlights, when I ran them, illuminated a white wall of moisture that reflected their output back at us and blinded us to whatever lay beyond. We were sealed inside my creation, and my creation was sealed inside the fog. And for the first time, I felt the thing that I believe Norah and Maya had already felt. The walls I'd built weren't protecting us from the world. They were separating us from information about it, which is a different kind of danger. Gil went out in the lobster boat on July 5th, not outside the barrier, through the cove, checking the fish traps he'd set along the interior pilings. He took Patricia's marine radio and maintained contact. The traps were producing pollock, cunner, a few crabs, enough to supplement our canned stores and extend the timeline. But while checking the traps, he reported something I'd been dreading. "Connor, I've got movement under the boat. Visibility's about 4 feet down. There are figures on the bottom, inside the barrier." I was on the dock, radio in hand, Norah beside me. "How many?" "3 that I can see. They're standing on the sand near the south piling line, just standing, not moving toward the boat. Get back to the dock. They're not aggressive. They're just there, like they walked in and stopped. The net has a gap on the south side where the ledge drops off. I knew the seal wasn't perfect. Get back to the dock, Gil." He came back. We stood on the dock together, looking at water we could no longer trust. The cove, my cove, the protected space I'd spent a month fortifying, had been penetrated not by force, but by geography. The dead had walked the bottom the way they walked every surface, indifferent to medium, and my barrier had a flaw I'd known about and rationalized away. "I can fix it," I said. "Dive down, extend the netting to the substrate, anchor it with rebar stakes." In water with 3 of them standing on the bottom. They're not fast underwater. The resistance slows them. "Connor?" Gil put his hand on my shoulder. I don't think anyone had touched me in weeks. "You can fix this particular gap, and there'll be another one, and you'll fix that, and there'll be another. You built a fence in the ocean. The ocean doesn't respect fences. What's the alternative? I don't know, but the alternative to patching holes forever isn't necessarily a better hole." I dove anyway, alone, because I wouldn't risk Gil in the water, wearing my old commercial dry suit and carrying a rebar stake gun and a roll of galvanized netting. The visibility was 5 feet. I worked by touch, the way I'd worked for 2 decades on hull repairs in dark harbors seeding the stakes into the sand and lacing the netting to the existing barrier. The 3 figures Gil had seen were 12 yards from my work area. I could see their legs, pants, shoes, the ordinary clothing of people who'd walked into the sea wearing whatever they'd died in. They didn't approach. They swayed with the current like kelp. I sealed the gap. I surfaced. Norah was on the dock with a boat hook, which she would have used to pull me out if I'd needed it. The look on her face was not relief. It was the expression of someone watching a pattern they've identified play out exactly as predicted. "How many more gaps?" she asked. "I'll survey the full perimeter." That's not what I asked. She was right. The question wasn't how many gaps existed. The question was whether the concept of a barrier in a fluid medium was fundamentally sound. And the answer was one I couldn't weld my way around. The survey took 3 days of diving alone in water that contained an increasing number of standing dead. By July 10th, I had counted 19 figures on the cove bottom, distributed along the barrier perimeter in a pattern that corresponded to the tidal current they entered, where the water pushed them in and stopped where the bottom friction exceeded the current's force. They were not hunting. They were not clustering around the dock or the boathouse or anywhere humans concentrated above. They were geological, deposited like sediment. And they terrified me in a way that aggressive pursuit never had, because their passivity made them permanent. I sealed 4 additional gaps, each one requiring an hour of bottom work in visibility that worsened daily as the dead's presence on the sand disturbed the substrate and clouded the water. Each repair consumed material I couldn't replace. Each repair addressed a symptom while the condition advanced. On the evening of July 10th, I laid the survey results on the kitchen table. All 10 of us were present. The 4 adults at the table, the 6 children on the stairs and in the doorway, listening with the unnerving competence of young people who have learned that adult conversations contain information relevant to whether they continue to exist. The barrier has 19 confirmed breaches along the substrate line. I've sealed 8. The remaining 11 are in deeper water where the ledge drops below my safe working depth without a dive partner. Additionally, the tidal cycle is bringing new entries faster than I can repair existing gaps. At current accumulation rates, the cove bottom will hold approximately 60 standing dead within 2 weeks. They're passive now. There is no guarantee they'll remain passive. Patricia asked the question nobody else would. What happens if they become active? If they move toward the surface or the dock, we lose access to the water entirely. No fishing, no boat operations. Our food supply reverts to the canned stores, which at current consumption lasts 3 weeks. Silence. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are all thinking the same thing and hoping someone else will say it first. Maya said it. The barrier is the problem. The barrier is the only thing keeping the numbers from being worse, I said. No, the barrier is what's trapping them inside the cove. They walk in through the gaps, but they can't walk out, because the current that pushes them in doesn't reverse enough to push them back through the same gaps. Your wall is a lobster trap for dead people. She said this with the flat precision of someone stating a geometric proof. And the silence that followed was the silence of 10 people recognizing that a 15-year-old had diagnosed a structural flaw that the man who'd built the structure had been unable to see, because seeing it would mean seeing himself. Gil spoke next. If we remove the barrier, the cove becomes open water. The dead walk in and walk out with the tides. They don't accumulate. But we also lose our protection from larger numbers approaching by sea. We never had that protection, Maya said. They walk the bottom. A net doesn't stop walking. Norah was drawing on her sketchpad, not looking up. "She's right, Dad. I know she's right. The admission cost me something I couldn't name, not pride. I'd exhausted pride weeks ago, patching gaps in a wall I'd known was failing. Something deeper. The admission cost me the belief that my hands could solve this problem. That fabrication, the physical manipulation of steel and cable and concrete, was an adequate response to a threat that didn't respect the material world the way I did. The dead didn't care about my welds. They didn't test my structures with force or intention. They simply existed in the water the way water exists in a pipe, flowing through every opening, accumulating in every low point, obeying physics that my engineering couldn't override because the physics weren't mechanical. They were fluid. I am a man who has spent his entire life imposing structure on materials that resist it. Steel bends when you heat it. Cable tensions when you torque it. Concrete sets when you mix it. Every problem I've ever solved has been a conversation between my will and a material's resistance, ending with the material's compliance. The dead were the first material that didn't comply, and the structure I'd built to contain them was complying instead. With their physics, not mine. I did not remove the barrier immediately. I want to be honest about this because the delay is where the second death lives. On July 12th, 2 days after Maya's diagnosis, I was still evaluating options, which meant I was sitting in the boathouse with engineering drawings I'd revised 14 times, trying to design a barrier that addressed the flaw without eliminating the structure. A one-way gate, a tidal flush system, a bottom-sealed variant that used weighted chain instead of rigid netting. Each design was more complex than the last, and each one collapsed under the same objection. You cannot fence the ocean floor against something that walks on it with the indifference of a geological process. While I evaluated, the accumulation continued. 23 figures on the cove bottom by my last count, though the worsening visibility meant the actual number could have been higher. And while I evaluated, the children needed to eat, which meant Gil needed to check the traps, which meant Gil was on the water above an increasing number of standing dead in a boat whose hull was 22 inches from whatever passed for their awareness. Patricia came to the boathouse at noon on July 12th. She stood in the doorway, the same doorway Maya had occupied when she'd measured the distance between safety and imprisonment, and said, "Gil is going out to check the traps. I know. He goes every other day. Today I don't want him to go. We need the fish, Patricia. I know we need the fish. I'm telling you, my brother is going out in a boat over a field of dead bodies because you haven't taken down the wall that's holding them in. And if something happens to him, it will be because you delayed. Not because of the dead. Because of you." She said this without anger. Anger I could have deflected. She said it as a factual assessment, the way a teacher evaluates a student's work. Here is the error. Here is the consequence. The grade is yours. Gil went out. Gil checked the traps. Gil came back with 12 pollock and a face I couldn't read. That evening, while the children ate grilled fish on the observation deck in a fog that made the Atlantic invisible, I heard the first sound from the cove that wasn't a bump. It was a scraping, continuous, coming from the direction of the north piling line, closest to the dock. I went to the dock edge and aimed a flashlight down. The visibility was 2 feet. I couldn't see bottom, but the scraping continued. Metal on rock, rhythmic, purposeful in a way that the previous bumps had not been. Something's climbing the piling. Gil said behind me. He'd followed me to the dock, carrying the shotgun he'd brought from Gloucester. I lay flat on the dock and put my face close to the water. The flashlight caught movement. A hand, gray, swollen, fingers half curled, gripping a barnacle-crusted rebar cage I'd welded to the piling 6 weeks ago. One of my fish habitat structures. My aggressive fish joke to Frank Pereira, who was dead because of my gait. The hand gripped and pulled, and another hand appeared above it. And the scraping was the sound of dead fingers on steel I'd welded, using my own construction as a ladder out of the water I'd trapped them in. Gil fired the shotgun into the water. The sound was enormous in the fog. On the observation deck, Patricia screamed. Children screamed. The climbing stopped. But from across the cove, from the south piling line and the east barrier and the western headland, I heard other sounds beginning. Scraping, bumping, the particular vibration of bodies in contact with a structure that I had built to keep things out, and that was now providing them with handholds to climb in. I stood on the dock in the fog with the floodlights turning the world white and the sounds of my fortress being used against me rising from every direction. And I said to Gil, "We take it down, tonight. Taking down a structure you built is not the reverse of building it. Building has a logic, foundation to frame to skin, each layer supporting the next. Demolition has a different logic. Identify the failure point, remove the key member, let gravity and tension do the work your tools can't." I knew demolition. I'd cut apart structures underwater for 20 years. But I'd never cut apart something I'd built with my own grief as the blueprint. And the experience was not mechanical. It was surgical in the most personal sense, cutting into my own body of work and finding pathology where I'd believed there was strength. Gil and I took the skiff out at 11 p.m. with cutting torches, pry bars, and the reckless focus of men who understand that delay has already cost too much. The fog was absolute. We navigated by the sound of the generator and the glow of the single floodlight Norah kept aimed at the water from the dock. I started with the north piling line, the section closest to the dock, the section where the climbing had begun. I went into the water in my dry suit with the cutting torch and began severing the rebar cages from the pilings. Each cut released a section of netting that sank to the bottom, and with it sank the structure that had given the dead their ladder. I worked by feel and by the blue-white light of the torch, which illuminated a sphere of 3 feet around me and nothing else. I could hear them. Below me, around me, the slow displacement of water that meant bodies in motion. The dead I'd trapped in the cove were responding to my presence, not aggressively, not with the speed of hunters, but with the ponderous reorientation of things that notice disturbance, the way anemones notice current. They turned toward me. They began walking toward the light. "Connor, you've got movement on sonar," Gil said over the radio from the skiff. He'd dropped a fish finder transducer over the side and was watching the screen. 4 contacts converging on your position, bearing south, distance 20 yards. Copy. How fast? Walking speed, maybe 1 knot. At 1 knot, I had approximately 40 seconds before they reached me. I cut faster. The torch severed the last rebar cage on the north section, and I moved laterally to the next piling, pulling myself along the barrier's top cable like a climber on a traverse line. The netting here was fouled with kelp and debris. And when I cut the first attachment point, the entire panel swung inward with the current and tangled around my legs. I didn't panic. Panic underwater kills faster than anything that lives in the water. I cleared the netting with 3 controlled cuts, losing skin on my left hand where the torch proximity heated the glove beyond its tolerance, and kept moving. The fish finder updated. 6 contacts, 15 yards. I cut the second panel free, the third, the fourth. By midnight, I'd opened a 60-foot gap in the north barrier. The tidal current was ebbing, flowing outward from cove to open ocean. And through the gap, the current began to do what Maya had predicted. It carried things out. Not all of them, not quickly. But the dead who had been standing near the north piling line were now in moving water without barriers. And moving water moved them. They drifted through the gap and into the open Atlantic, where the current dispersed them along the coast. I came up. Gil pulled me onto the skiff. I was shaking. Cold, exertion, the delayed physiological response to working in darkness, surrounded by things that wanted nothing but whose. Nothing was indistinguishable from wanting everything. South section next? Gil asked. All of it, every section. By morning, I want nothing left but the pilings. We worked until 4 a.m. Norah joined us at 2, arriving in the station's inflatable dinghy with fresh torch fuel and a thermos of coffee, and the particular expression of someone who was participating in the destruction of a thing she'd hated and finding it more complicated than satisfaction. She handed me the thermos and said, "You're bleeding through your glove." "I know." "Give me the torch." "You don't dive." "I'm not diving. I'm cutting from the surface." Gil holds the light. "You guide the panels from below. I cut. 3 people, 3 jobs. We finish before dawn." She'd never held a cutting torch. I showed her the ignition sequence, the angle, the distance from the material, the way to read the color of the flame for temperature. She learned in 3 minutes, with the same focused absorption Helen had brought to every new skill. And she began cutting the surface cable runs while I cleared the subsurface attachments from below. By 5 a.m. the barrier was gone. Not entirely. The pilings remained, and fragments of netting hung from them like shed skin. But the continuous structure that had enclosed the cove was open. The tide had been ebbing for hours, and the current had carried an unknowable number of standing dead out through the gaps and into the Atlantic. I surfaced for the last time and floated on my back in the open cove, looking up at a sky that was beginning to lighten through the fog. And I felt something I did not expect. Loss, not relief. Loss. The barrier had been pathological. Maya was right. It had been a trap, a monument to my inability to process grief through anything except fabrication. A wall I'd built between myself and the acceptance that some things cannot be walled. And I missed it. I missed the illusion of control it had provided. I missed the sound of my own welding, the productive solitude of underwater work, the belief that each bead of filler metal was a sentence in an argument I was winning against the chaos of a world that had taken my wife and was now taking everything else. Norah reached down from the skiff and pulled me out of the water. Her hands were strong, stronger than I remembered. The cove without the barrier was a different place, not safer. The word had lost its meaning in the absolute sense, but more honest. We could see what approached. We could see what left. The fog lifted on July 14th, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the Atlantic spread out to the horizon in every direction, and the absence of my wall let the world back in. The immediate effect was practical. The standing dead cleared from the cove within 2 tidal cycles. The bottom, when I checked it from the dock with a weighted camera, gill rigged from a waterproof housing and a length of line, was empty. The current did what Maya said it would, cycled things through rather than trapping them. Individual dead still walked the bottom occasionally, carried in by the flood tide and carried out by the ebb, transient rather than accumulating. The cove became usable. Gil moved his trap operations to the outer pilings, now stripped of their cages but still functional as anchor points. And the fish catch improved because the open water allowed schooling species to move through. The second effect was psychological, and it divided the group in a way I hadn't predicted. The children responded to the open cove with something approaching joy. Callum, who had not spoken until he asked to swim, began speaking in full sentences, not about the old world or what he'd lost, but about what he could see. Fish, birds, the color changes in the water as the tide shifted, the way the granite headlands turned orange at sunset. He asked Norah to teach him to swim. She did, cautiously at first, in the shallows near the dock where the bottom was visible and the water was protected by the natural headlands on 3 sides. The other children followed. By the 3rd day, all 6 were in the water every afternoon, during the warmest hours, supervised by Norah and Patricia. And the sound of children in the cove was so dissonant with the world beyond the point that it functioned as a kind of hallucination, proof that normalcy was possible, if normalcy was defined as small humans doing what small humans do when they encounter water. The adults did not share this ease. Gil fished with one eye on the depth finder and one hand near the shotgun. Patricia maintained the food rotation with an efficiency that masked a vigilance. I could read in the way she counted heads every 15 minutes. And I stood on the observation deck and watched the open water and missed my wall with a longing that shamed me. Because the longing was not for safety, but for the activity of building it. My hands had nothing to do. For the first time since April, I was not constructing, not repairing, not fabricating. The station was functional. The boathouse was equipped. The generator ran. The cistern collected rain. There was nothing to weld, nothing to cut, nothing to impose my will upon. And in the absence of that imposition, I discovered what lived beneath it. The awareness that I had used construction the way other men use alcohol, as a barrier between myself and the thing I couldn't face. Helen had been dead for 5 years. Norah had been 18 when she'd watched her mother die in a hospital room that smelled like industrial cleaner and morphine. I had been in the hallway when it happened because I'd stepped out to take a phone call, a work call, a client with an emergency repair on a pier in Camden. And when I'd come back, Helen was gone, and Norah was holding her hand and looking at me with an expression I'd spent 5 years building things to avoid seeing again. The expression said, "You were not here." Every structure I'd built since, the welding school renovation, the barrier, the fortress, was an answer to that accusation. I was here. I was building. I was present in the only language I spoke fluently, which was the language of material manipulation. And if that language couldn't say I'm sorry, it could at least say I'm busy, which in my family had always been accepted as a substitute for emotional participation. The barrier's absence removed the substitute. I was no longer busy. I was a 53-year-old man standing on a deck watching his daughter do the thing he'd failed to do, connect with other humans through presence rather than production. And the recognition was not a revelation. It was an exposure, a wound open to air for the first time. Norah came up to the deck that evening, wet-haired from swimming, and sat beside me. The sunset was doing something extraordinary to the water. Neither of us mentioned it. "The pilings are still out there," she said. "I know. Some of them are tilting, the ones on the south side where the ledge is shallow. Without the netting holding them in alignment, the wave action is loosening them. I'll pull them. You don't have to pull them. Loose pilings are a navigation hazard. If Gil hits one with the boat, Dad, you don't have to pull them. Leave them. Let the ocean take them. Let the ocean take them." Let the thing I'd built decay on its own schedule and its own medium without my intervention. The suggestion was so antithetical to everything I understood about maintenance, denial, and responsibility that I physically recoiled. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's new," she said, and almost smiled. The pilings became the terms of a negotiation between me and the version of myself I was becoming, conducted silently over the course of 3 weeks, in which the world outside our point continued its collapse, and the world inside our point continued its strange, provisional reconstruction. I didn't pull the pilings. I watched them instead. The wave action tilted the south ones first, as Norah had noted, and by late July 2 had fallen completely, lying on the cove bottom like felled trees, already becoming substrate for muscle attachment. The others held but shifted, each storm loosening them further, each tide working the granite around their bases. The ocean was disassembling my work with the patient indifference of a force that operates on timescales I couldn't match. And watching it do so was an education in a kind of power I'd spent my life opposing. The power of not acting. Gil and I developed a routine that replaced the fortress-building frenzy with something sustainable. He fished. I maintained the station systems. Generator, cistern, the actual habitable infrastructure that had existed before my defensive additions. Patricia organized the household. Norah taught. Not formally. She'd been an art student, not an educator. But the children needed structure, and she provided it through a curriculum that was part drawing, part marine biology, gleaned from field guides she'd found in the station's original library, and part storytelling, which she was better at than she knew. Maya became my unexpected interlocutor. The 15-year-old who diagnosed my barrier as a lobster trap took to spending time in the boathouse, watching me work on maintenance tasks, asking questions that were architectural in nature, but philosophical in intent. "Why did you become a welder?" "Because I was good with my hands and bad with people." "That's not a reason. That's a diagnosis." "It's both." "Did you like going underwater?" "I loved it. No sound except your own breathing. No company except the work. Everything reduced to the joint in front of you." "That sounds like hiding." "It sounds like focus." "Same thing, from the outside." She was relentless in the way that intelligent adolescents are relentless, willing to push past the social boundaries that adults observe because she hadn't yet learned to treat those boundaries as real. I found our conversations uncomfortable, illuminating, and necessary in a way I couldn't articulate. Maya saw me the way the ocean saw my pilings, as a structure that had served a purpose and was now available for reconsideration. On August 3rd, a second boat appeared. This one came from the north, a 22-foot center console running at speed, and it carried 3 adults who were not refugees. They were armed, organized, and they circled the point twice before approaching the cove, assessing our position with a tactical focus that made Gil reach for the shotgun and me reach for a wrench, which tells you everything about our respective instincts. The lead figure, a woman in her 40s with close cropped gray hair and a semi-automatic rifle slung across her chest, cut her engine outside the cove and called out. "We're from the Monaghan community, 47 people established on the island. We've been mapping the coast for survivors and resources. We're not here to take anything. We're here to count you." "Count us for what?" I called back. "For the network. We're connecting every surviving group between Eastport and Kittery. Shared information, shared resources, mutual defense. You have a fortified position here, and we'd like to include you." I looked at Gil. Gil looked at Norah. Norah looked at me. "We're not fortified," I said. "Not anymore." The woman, her name was Diane Okoro, former Coast Guard lieutenant commander, and the irony of her service branch was not lost on me. lowered her rifle, and raised an eyebrow. Your observation deck gives you a 5-mile sightline. Your cove provides protected anchorage. Your boathouse has a marine railway that could service any vessel on this coast. Fortification isn't just walls, Mr. Bryce. It's capability. She was redefining my vocabulary. Fortification as capability rather than enclosure. The station's value wasn't in what I'd added to it. The barrier, the gate, the container wall. But in what it already was. A maritime infrastructure point with tools, shelter, and deep water access. Everything I'd built on top of that was noise. Everything that had been there since 1941 was the signal. Come in, I said. We'll talk. Diane Okoro stayed for 2 days. She told us about Monhegan, a fishing island 12 miles offshore that had been naturally isolated enough to avoid the worst of the outbreak, and had organized quickly under the leadership of its year-round residents, who were accustomed to self-sufficiency in bad weather. She told us about the network she was building, a chain of coastal survivor groups connected by boat traffic and VHF radio, sharing fish catches, medical knowledge, and early warning about the dead's movements along the shore. She also told us about the dead in the water, and what she said changed everything I thought I understood. They don't just walk the bottom, Diane said. We were on the observation deck, 4 adults looking out at open water that seemed benign in the August sunlight. They raft. Raft, I repeated. They accumulate in tidal convergence zones, places where opposing currents meet and slow down. They pile up on the surface like driftwood. We've seen rafts of 100 or more, floating in the Gulf of Maine, moving with the prevailing current. They're not swimming. They're not navigating. They're debris. But debris moves, and when it hits a shore, it deposits. How far do they travel? We tracked one raft from a satellite image that Monhegan's former marine biologist interpreted before we lost internet. It originated somewhere near Boston Harbor and moved northeast along the coast for 60 miles before grounding on Vinalhaven. Deposited approximately 200 dead on the island in a single tide. Vinalhaven had survivors. They didn't survive the deposit. The word deposit, not attack, not invasion. Deposit. The dead as sediment. The ocean as a conveyor. My barrier, had it still existed, would have caught a raft the way a net catches a log boom, and the deposition would have been inside my cove, concentrated, inescapable. Your barrier would have killed you, Diane said, reading my face. I've seen it happen. A group near Booth Bay built a boom across their harbor entrance. A raft hit it at night during a storm surge. The boom held, but the dead piled up behind it until they formed a solid mass that people could walk across. The harbor was overrun in hours. I sat with this for a long time. The confirmation that my instinct, wall, barrier, enclosure, was not just flawed but specifically lethal in the maritime environment, was not new information. Maya had diagnosed it. Norah had felt it. But hearing it from a Coast Guard officer who'd seen it play out elsewhere gave it the weight of evidence rather than intuition. What do you do instead? I asked. You stay mobile. You stay connected. You keep the water open so it works for you. Carries things through instead of trapping them. And you watch. The network's primary function isn't defense. It's early warning. If a raft is moving along the coast, the station that sees it first radios the stations downstream. Everyone has time to prepare or relocate. You can't relocate from an island. No, but you can get in a boat. The dead don't operate boats. The water between us is the safest space on Earth, as long as you have fuel and a hull. The danger is only at the edges, where water meets land. The answer isn't to wall the edges. It's to live on the water and touch the edges only when you choose to. after Diane left, promising to return on her next coastal circuit and to include Cutter Point in the radio network. I sat in the boathouse and looked at my tools. The cutting torches, the welding rig, the fabrication equipment I'd accumulated over a career of joining metal to metal in hostile environments. These tools had built the barrier. They had also dismantled it. They were neutral, capable of construction and destruction in equal measure, shaped by the intention of the user rather than any inherent purpose. What was my intention now? Norah found me there at dusk. She sat on the workbench, legs dangling, the way she'd sat as a child in my shop in Camden while I'd worked on small jobs, and she'd drawn pictures of what I was building. Diane's network needs a maintenance station, she said. Boats break down, engines fail, hulls get damaged. You could service them here. The marine railway can haul anything up to 40 feet. That's not a fortress. No, that's a port. A port. An open point of contact between water and land, designed not to exclude, but to receive, repair, and release. The architectural opposite of everything I'd built since June. The word saddened me like a key finding a lock I hadn't known existed. I dismantled the container wall on August 10th. Gil and Patricia helped. We used the lobster boat and a makeshift crane to lift each container off the access road and onto the shore below the station, where we repurposed them as storage for the Marine Railway's expanding operation, the gate. The first thing I'd built, the steel plate and structural tube monument to my fear. I cut apart with the same torch I'd used to assemble it and stacked the pieces in the boathouse as raw material for future fabrication. The access road was open. Anyone could drive or walk from the coast highway to the station. This fact terrified me in a way that the open cove had not, because the cove's openness was mediated by water. A barrier of distance and medium that provided passive protection. The road was just road, gravel and dirt leading straight to my front door. Norah and I had our first real conversation on the morning the wall came down. Not about logistics, not about construction, not about the dead, about Helen. We were sitting on the front steps of the main house, drinking coffee that was running low and would need to be replaced from whatever the network could trade. And the open road stretched in front of us like a sentence we hadn't finished. I was on the phone when she died, I said. Norah didn't respond immediately. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the road. I know, she said. I heard you in the hallway. I heard you say, I'll call you back. And I heard you come in, but she was already gone. And I was 18 and I thought this. I thought, he's going to come in and see that he missed it, and he's going to fall apart. And you didn't. You walked to the bed and you picked up her other hand, and you stood there and you didn't say anything. And I realized you weren't going to fall apart, because you'd already decided not to. You'd already built the wall. Norah, let me finish. I've been waiting 5 years to finish. You built a wall that day, and you've been building walls ever since. And every wall was the same wall, Dad. The one between you and the fact that you weren't there. And I was so angry at you. Not for missing it, because that was a phone call. That was 30 seconds. That was nothing. I was angry because you looked at her body and you didn't cry. I needed you to cry. I needed to know that someone else was destroyed by it the way I was. And you gave me nothing. The coffee in my cup was cold. I hadn't drunk any of it. I was destroyed, I said. I've been destroyed for 5 years. I just couldn't stop building long enough to notice. I know that now. I didn't know it then. Does knowing it help? It doesn't undo it. But it makes the last 9 weeks make sense. You built the barrier because you were still building the wall from the hospital. And you took it down because... She stopped, looked at me directly. Why did you take it down? I considered the question. The honest answer had multiple components, not all of which I'd sorted. Maya's diagnosis, the climbing dead, the trapped accumulation, Gil's patience, Patricia's accusation, Norah's drawings, Diane's intelligence about the rafts. Each was a force that had acted on my decision the way tidal current acts on a piling, incrementally from different directions until the structure's resistance was exceeded. But the answer that mattered, the one Norah was asking for, was simpler. Because I watched you cut it apart, and your hands on the torch looked like mine, and I realized I'd rather you inherit the tools than the walls. She set her coffee down. She put her head on my shoulder, which she hadn't done since she was 14, since before Helen's diagnosis, since the last time our family had been a structure with all its members intact. I put my arm around her, and we sat on the steps and watched the open road. And I did not cry, because I'm not built that way. But something in me that had been welded shut for 5 years cracked along the bead and let the heat escape. The network grew. By September, Diane's coastal chain included 11 stations between Machias and Portland, linked by VHF radio and a boat circuit that ran weekly, carrying supplies, personnel, and information. Cutter Point became what Norah had named it, a port. Gil and I hauled the first outside vessel, a 30-foot sloop from the Pemaquid station with a damaged rudder, up the Marine Railway on August 22nd. And I repaired it in 3 days using skills I'd practiced for 2 decades and was now applying not to my own constructions, but to other people's. The work was different. When I built the barrier, each weld was a conversation with my own fear. Private, obsessive, self-referential. When I repaired the rudder, the weld was a conversation with the vessel's owner, a woman named Addie Sinclair who stood in the boathouse and described the damage and the conditions that caused it and the way she needed the repair to perform. And my job was not to impose my design, but to serve hers. The distinction remade my relationship with the torch. I was no longer building for myself. I was building for traffic. Callum learned to swim. I watched from the observation deck on a September morning so clear the horizon was a ruled line. And the boy who hadn't spoken for weeks after Gloucester was now shouting for Norah to watch him float on his back, arms spread, face to the sky, trusting the water that had carried dead things to also carry living ones. Norah watched. She applauded. She looked up at me on the deck and raised a hand, and I raised mine back, and the distance between us, the deck to the waterline, maybe 30 vertical feet, felt like the first honest measurement I'd taken since arriving at Cutter Point. Maya started welding. She asked, I taught, and her first bead was crooked and porous, and she studied it with the critical eye of someone who intended to improve and had the patience to do it badly until she could do it well. She did not remind me of myself. She reminded me of Norah, who had approached drawing the same way, analytically unsatisfied with natural talent alone, determined to understand the mechanism beneath the gift. I let Maya work in the boathouse unsupervised, which was a trust I would not have extended in the old world, where liability and regulation governed such decisions, and which in this world was simply the recognition that a 15-year-old who could diagnose a structural flaw deserved the tools to build a structural solution. The dead remained. They walked the coast road intermittently, usually in small numbers, drawn by whatever logic governed their movement. Sound, memory, the simple imperative to continue in the last direction they'd faced. We watched them from the observation deck. Sometimes they turned down the access road toward the station, and when they did, we intercepted them quietly at distance before they reached the buildings. This was not a task I performed alone. Gil, Patricia, David from the Pemaquid station who'd stayed on after his rudder repair, and eventually Maya, who turned 16 in September and handled the responsibility with a gravity that made me trust her more than I trusted myself. All participated in the perimeter watches. There was no wall. There was a tension. On September 29th, a raft deposited on the coast 3 miles south. Diane's network caught it. The Tenants Harbor Station reported a mass in the water at dawn, moving northeast on the prevailing current, and we had 6 hours of warning. Gil moved the boats out of the cove. Patricia took the children to the second floor. I stood on the observation deck with binoculars and watched approximately 150 dead things wash onto the rocks below the coast highway, tumble in the surf, and begin the slow process of standing up and walking inland. They did not come to Cutter Point. The geography routed them east, away from the promontory, into the marshland behind the next cove, where the terrain absorbed them like a sponge absorbs a spill. Some would re-emerge, some would remain, standing in marsh water, gradually sinking into mud. The coast was not clean. It would not be clean in my lifetime. But the warning had worked. The network had functioned, and the station had survived, not because it was sealed, but because it was informed. That evening, I sat on the dock with my feet above the water. The tide was coming in. Somewhere beneath the surface, things moved that had no business moving. Above the surface, in the main house, Patricia was reading to the children. In the boathouse, Maya was practicing beads on scrap steel. On the observation deck, Norah was drawing the sunset. I let my hands rest on my knees. They were scarred, burned, calloused, and empty. They held nothing. They built nothing. They were available. It was enough. The station is still here. The pilings in the cove have mostly fallen. The last 3 stand at angles that Callum uses as landmarks when he swims to the headland and back, which he does every morning now, fast enough that Norah has stopped counting his strokes and started timing them instead. I welded a new sign for the access road last week. Not steel plate, driftwood, with letters torched in. Cutter Point Marine Services. Maya designed it. Norah approved it. Gil said it needed to be bigger. Patricia said it was fine. Diane's network now reaches 23 stations. The weekly boat circuit has become bi-weekly. I service 4 to 6 vessels a month, which keeps my hands full and my mind in the work, which is where it belongs. In the joint, in the bead, in the material conversation between heat and metal that I've spoken fluently my entire life. Helen is still dead. The world is still broken. My daughter is still the bravest person I've ever met. And I'm still learning at 53 to leave the door open and trust what comes through it. The cove fills and empties twice a day. I let it.